The music that underscored the introduction to this conversation is a performance that you and I assembled recently of Beethoven's Egmont Overture. It was a COVID-19 project that resulted from the necessity of making music while social distancing. Egmont is a piece that we've played in many contexts and on at least 3 continents. It would seem to be the perfect piece for clarifying how you discover or perhaps uncover narratives in music that can speak to current social issues, and the role that those narratives play in creating a wider awareness of specific humanitarian causes.
Yes, I think the term uncover is more interesting than maybe discover. Now, Beethoven's Egmont Overture is a piece that was written for the theater, so there is actually a narrative, a storyline that it comments on and reflects. But that aside, if we just look at the music, it begins with 2 problems which should be solved, so to speak. And that logic would have been recognized and understood by audiences of the time. And indeed, it's accessible to us today. But the 2 problems are, 1, it begins with a dance called the saraband, which would have been very familiar to people, audiences of the time, as a Spanish couple dance, very elegant, very light, and you know, a romantic dance, if you will. It is presented in this instance as a brutal, heavy, monstrous, inhumane sort of thing that sort of rears up like some sort of animal at the very beginning of the piece. The second question or problem that is posed is that the piece is in the minor mode. It is in the key of F minor, and the solution, the traditional, normative, understandable solution for people of the time would have been that a resolution, a solution, a liberation is arrived at when the piece gets to the major mode of the same key, F major in this case. And the piece, of course, Egmont and all the incidental music, the overture and the incidental music was written to accompany as a kind of soundtrack to a play of the same name by Goethe. Now, the piece, the play has a historical context. And the historical context is that it is the story of one of the incidents, one of the chapters of the Spanish occupation of the Netherlands. And Mark, you and I have actually played this piece in the southern Netherlands, in Maastricht, which is the scene of the story. So, we've actually taken Egmont to the land of Egmont, in a way. And the situation is that the Netherlands are under Spanish occupation. An insurrection led by our hero Egmont arises. It attempts to free the oppressed people through force. It fails. The hero Egmont loses his head, which is very dramatically and viscerally depicted at the end of the main section of the piece. And then a new kind of effort or a new kind of awareness ensues, and a whole different operation unfolds, a different approach unfolds. And the result of that is a true liberation, both in terms of the meter, which frees up the piece, the music, from the dominant triple meter of the piece, and leads to the major mode. But it leads to the major mode in such a way that the oppressing tonality itself is also transformed, so that inside the freedom of the new mode is embedded certain aspects of the oppressive minor mode. So it's almost as if to suggest that a liberation from oppression is not actually complete until the oppressor is included. That is to say, a problem is not completely solved unless the question itself is somehow transformed, that the problem itself is transformed. And this is terribly important to any number of situations. And so we have found it very useful to include it in a number of contexts.
So yes, you're exactly right. We have played this piece in a variety of contexts. We played it for Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, a few years back, and about 30 delegates. But we've also played it, for instance, in a class of mine at Southern Connecticut State University, which is a university that has primarily a minority population, most of whom represent the first person from the family actually getting a college education. And I think what interests me most of all is that people understand this argument. The argument seems to be something that a huge variety of backgrounds, people's backgrounds, can grasp and engage. And that's kind of amazing, because in music, the idea of a concept is pretty abstract. And yet the music, this particular piece, carries these ideas so clearly that people seem to be able to just understand. Could you speak to this a little bit?
What we do at Music for Life International with our effort to create resonances with the music itself is that we look for places within the music, within the actual sounds of the pieces that we use, which somehow present, in part or in whole, the mission of the project. So in this instance, our larger extrapolation was that Beethoven seems to be saying, through the actual materials of the Egmont Overture, that violence or the use of force can only reliably produce more violence. And there comes a place at the end of the main body of the piece where the music does not resolve, and the protagonist Egmont loses his head. He is captured and he is put to death by the oppressing forces. And at that moment, the music returns. Beethoven takes the music back to the original condition of the opening of the curtain with the big note, the single note F, which is the tonality of the piece. The F tone, which is spread out like a great curtain at the very beginning of the piece over 6 octaves. And that very note returns at this moment where the body of the piece, which is in a model called sonata form, at the end of the sonata form, when you normally would find that resolution, instead we have the opening condition and a reminder that the problems have not been solved. But this time, from that opening note,
Yes, that
go ahead.
initial note is recapitulated, as you say. Interestingly, a few things that sort of capture my musical attention. At the opening, it is just an octave. It actually is a span of 5 octaves. But the way it's asserted and the natural placement of that pitch in register makes it, gives it a really particular kind of harshness. And although it may function as a curtain-raising kind of element, I see that it already sets in motion some of the argument that you're already talking about. And to me, it's also interesting that at the end of the piece, before the recapitulation, that same note comes back, but it has none of the assertion and self-confidence that it initially had when first presented.
Absolutely. It comes back in this very bare, understated, but essential form, single note in a single octave. And out of that, a kind of spreading out occurs. It seems to go into itself and unfold its, to use a metaphor from physics, a kind of implicate folded order. It unfolds into a new kind of a kind of harmonic possibility. And in that moment, what is interesting is it appears that effort and meter and rhythm itself is suspended, because the music moves in very long note values. Nothing happens except every 2 bars, 2 measures of music. And so there is almost a sense that the inevitable awakening, the inevitable sorts of realizations are allowed to unfold, and that, in a way, harkens almost to, science of our time, which someone like David Bohm has elucidated in his theory of wholeness and the implicate order. And so at that junction, when you have these 8 bars of what was folded in now being unfolded, the result is an open kind of doorway, a portal, through which the possibility of a liberation that includes oppressor and oppressed alike can unfold. And we hear it very, very clearly in the music.
So at the end of this piece, when we get to the coda, there's a clear change in the power differential. And one of the arguments that you've been making is that in order for a true resolution to happen, both parties have to have voice. So that it is both the previously oppressed and the oppressor. So I'd really be curious if you could clarify how you see the original oppressing agent in the piece, how it manifests in this jubilant music, because it is a true sea change in what's perceived just in terms of a purely musical argument.
Well, at the very beginning, the quality of oppression is rendered in two ways. One, the sensibility of it is the minor mode, and that minor mode famously is encapsulated by the tonic triad, the triad built on the keynote, the chord built on the keynote, which has the minor third above the tonic of the key, which in this case is A flat. But that is actually the whole minor key is made possible, harmonically speaking, by the flattened major sixth, the sixth note of the scale, which is D. And so as we go through, the note D flat is revealed at many junctures, but it's always, yes. So the D flat appears as for instance, at the first, in the exposition, the D flat is the key of the second theme. And that flattened sixth is a hallmark of the minor tonality, and it is the thing that causes the minor tonality to be established. And to jump ahead, when this jubilant, in a way, innovative F major tonic major is arrived at in the coda of the piece, what happens is there is a big celebration and the F major is established. And right at the peak of that celebration, there is this strange bass pattern, a chromatic walking bass pattern that appears. And it's almost, it's something that, 20th century American listeners, 20th and 21st century American listeners will be forgiven for the feeling that there's a relationship with certain kinds of jazz bass lines, which I think there is. And right in the middle of that 8-note pattern is the D flat, which leads exactly as a minor D flat would. But here it's not a minor, it does not generate a minor key. It strengthens the major liberation. And yet, the big thing here is that this situation, this quality of the oppressive tonality, which is the generator of the oppression, the generator of that tension, the generator of the conflict between A flat and A natural, which is so central to the F major liberation, is embraced. And embraced for what reason? To intensify the quality of liberation. And therefore, if you're listening to this from a kind of political standpoint, or with a sensibility of what oppression, of what freedom from oppression means. Freedom from oppression does not just mean making the oppressor go away. It means addressing the fundamental condition of oppression, which is that there is an impulse that caused one party to oppress another. And here, that impulse is not only neutralized, it is actually transformed into something that enables, literally freedom from for both the oppressor and the oppressed. I don't know if that clarifies things. There is a sort of political argument there as well, which is that, both oppression, both the condition of being oppressed and the act of oppressing are traumatic to the victim as well as to the perpetrator. And so in the resolution or liberation from oppression, there's a real need to address the trauma that is inflicted on both the oppressor and the oppressed. Both the oppressed and the oppressor, both the victim and the perpetrator. Otherwise, if that fundamental impulse is not
the pattern will repeat.
You're going to, exactly. History will repeat itself, and it does. And so that is a terribly powerful sort of lesson, reminder, and model that, we certainly in our time should be paying close attention to. And you'll remember what happened when we played this together for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, in the context of the Syrian civil conflict. And he took it quite personally, I think. And he mentioned something along the lines of, artists having reminded us over the centuries that the use of force only results in more force. And it was very poignant that after we played it, several months after we played it, he mentioned this to the joint meeting of the United Nations Security Council as they were discussing the Syrian situation.